in some parts, I think the presentation will be conceptual, you know, because it's a very new avenue of study, scientifically and design. And so I hope you can bear with me, and then I think let's make sense of things together as we go along, and then we can have more of an open discussion afterwards, after the presentation. So I kind of want to just give a general outline of kind of more or less what you can expect from the presentation. I'll start off by talking about the concept of the world, and then go into world building, and then I'll talk about colonialism, coloniality, decolonial technology, and then hopefully give some kind of a technical demo of something that is from my creative practice. So I want to start talking about like the idea of this world, the idea of the work, you know. And I think like when most times when we think about the world, this is kind of like what we think about, you know. We think about that's the world, you know. But I think this kind of notion that this might be world is slightly misleading, because this is actually the Earth, you know. This is a geological interstellar body that's suspended in space or ether, whatever you want to call it. So it's more of also a geological feature. That's not the world, at least. That's not how it's more deeply considered. The world looks something like this, you know. The world is really just the interconnected relations of all of these things that may inhabit a planet like Earth. So it's the interactions between things like animals, value systems, times, culture, knowledge, geography, environments, and people. And this world, whereas the other world is created like, I don't know if you're a creationist or whatever religious position you could take, but of course, the other world is created by, let's say, forces that we are still to determine. Who created that? The Earth. This world is created by mostly humans within this cluster of agents who exercise different levels of power. So I guess once you understand that, you can understand that depending on who's exercising power in this system of the world, at different times in the human history, they have predominantly created worlds and controlled what the world is, because their actions, of course, have power dynamics or are influenced by differences in power. So in talking about the world, I want to go on further, talk about the idea of like world building. So world building as defined by John Hamilton, which is kind of like, I mean, this style of coding is actually something that I try to avoid, but it's a process of constructing a world, originally an imaginary one, sometimes associated with a fictional world. And then Trent says, developing imaginary setting with coherent qualities such as history, geography, ecology. World building often involves the creation of geography, a backstory, flora, fauna, inhabitants, technology, different races, social customs, as well as invented languages. And so when we start to understand that this is kind of like how worlds are built, that even within considering the world that of the diagram that I showed before, it is first imagined and then sort of kind of implemented. So maybe it's useful if I give examples of other worlds that exist, because of course there have been other worlds between the ones that there have not been other Earths. This is also where you start to see the distinction. There have been other worlds between, before the one that we live in right now, and there will most likely be other worlds after this one. And this is where you also start to understand that we have agency in creating that world. And world building is really that agency. So I don't know how many of you recognize this specific world, but this world is from Game of Thrones, you know, which is like a popular TV show, of course. I think that's kind of based on a sort of post-medieval reading of modern-day Europe, so it's not completely, it's imagined, but of course it's imagined based on that basis. But the thing about the Game of Thrones world that's so convincing is that it has all those characteristics of a world. It has specific animals, dragons. It has specific languages, High Valerian and the other languages. It has different races, it has different currencies, it has different geography, and this is what makes it compelling as a world. And I have a kind of thesis that the reason that Middle Earth from Lord of the Rings and maybe Game of Thrones are so compelling worlds and so believable and persuasive worlds, it's exactly because they have those things figured out: geography, history, languages. And I think that's what it takes to make a world. And so then I want to kind of depart from this more fictitious, but debatable, this idea of like the Game of Thrones world to a world that we know that's kind of more familiar to us. This is another world, or a representation of a part of another world that we know. And here you can say, okay, this is the real world, right? And these are real borders. But of course, those borders were also created again by certain exercising of power differentials. You know, the borders that you see around most countries weren't always that way. They were created during a specific period of time, and that's when that's why this world looks like that. So we can't talk about this world really without talking about colonialism, you know, which is kind of like it's weird because it's kind of both the like hot buzz, hot word these days, but it's also the most dreadful, dreary kind of word to bring up. So of course, colonialism, as maybe some of you know, sort of created. I would like to say that European colonialism, because there are also other kinds of colonialisms that existed. You know, like the Mongol Empire, in a way, had certain constellations of a sort of federation with a capital. And I don't want to get ahead of myself in talking about how worlds are configured in a colonial world. But yeah, there are other colonialisms that existed. But there is one colonialism that we speak of when we speak of colonialism, and that one is European colonialism. You know, that started within the early 14th century until around the 1960s, when European powers perpetuated a territorial appropriation, exploitation of natural environments and human labor to take direct control of social structures. And the one that's kind of like much closer to what we're thinking about is, of course, colonization, or at least in Namibia and kind of like in Africa, the colonialism that unravels after what is called the Berlin Conference of 1884, where European powers met under the patronage of Otto von Bismarck and continued to, or started to carve up Africa into different territories. As you can see, the fine gentleman over there pointing to a map of Africa that doesn't have the colonial borders that we associate with the continent today. And so this kind of like this colonization of the world is kind of what is responsible for, I think, this specific state or instance of the world that we're living in right now. And so, according to philosophers like Dussel, there's this idea that European colonialism exists in a constellation or a configuration of a core and a periphery. Within the core, it is Europe. Europe is the core. And this is the zone of where sort of humans live and civilization lives and higher like ideals live. And on the periphery, that is where everyone else lives. So mostly Asia and Africa and some parts of the Middle East and Southern America as well. So that is the periphery. I mean, the idea we talk about for instance, the idea of like something that I often think about when I go back to the idea of world building is like we talk about global north and global south. I mean, you look at, for instance, like Australia. Geographically, Australia is not in the north, but it's considered as a northern a part of the global north, like in spite or despite its kind of like geographic position. And I think that also adds to this idea of world building being more of a conceptual thing that's sort of enacted and that's practiced through a system of colonialism. Yeah, so this is just Dussell's kind of like representation of what the colonial world looks like, is where you have a core and then you have a periphery that's kind of like on the outside. And so maybe it helps for me to say the other thing about the colonial, this configuration of having a core and a periphery, is that you have a core, which is the metropole or the capital, and then you have the colonies. And the only purpose of the colonies is to feed the core, and so the relationship between the core and the periphery is almost one of like an imbalanced, unequal exploitation. They have an extraction of resources, of human labor, of natural environments for the periphery in order to feed the development and the appetites of the core. But that things like quality of life and things like advancements rarely make it to the periphery. And if you think of Namibia or Africa in general as being part of the periphery, you can understand why this imbalance in a relationship between these two entities eventually creates a situation of underdevelopment, because it is never in the interests of the world of colonialism for the periphery to change its position. And then I want to talk about the one thing that kind of comes up when you talk about colonialism, is that critics would want to say, for instance, colonialism is something that happened a long time ago. For instance, here in Africa, when you have Pan-Africanism in the 50s, it's like where a territorial colonialism starts to end, And so I think in the minds of many sort of liberated nations, it's like we start to think, it's like, what is the relevance of talking about colonialism today if it is obviously something that's behind us? And this is what brings me to like coloniality. And coloniality is pretty much a definition, as I understand it, that talks about how these instantiations of power from colonialism continue to perpetuate themselves today. And one of the things that we can think about is that you look at the extractive kind of